Hey everybody, welcome to MicroGenres. I wanted to start this microgenre series with something that's very obvious, that everybody gets. The horror genre is this massive field of all kinds of subgenres. We got like vampires and werewolves and zombies and slashers and creature features and body horror and ghosts and demonic possessions and everything. And we can all agree that these are made up fantasy creatures and they are not real.
We got first and last names of 6 witches that are in our church. And you know what's strange? 3 of you are in this room right now.
Okay.
You better look in my eyeballs. We ain't afraid of you, you stinking witch. You so much as cough wrong and I'll expose you in front of everybody in this tent, you stinking witch.
Okay, so now that's scary stuff. I think that most of us would agree that witches aren't real and that the people in that room are just beyond help and ridiculous. And that is exactly the general consensus that I think people have of the kind of horror movies that we're going to be talking about today. Horror sequels that go to space. Just think about it, right? Space horror is a really cool subgenre. Alien, Event Horizon, Pandorum, etc., those kinds of movies. I mean, it makes sense, right? Space is a hypertense environment.
One direct hit on that plexiglass view screen and our innards will be turned inside out quicker than a pair of Lister's old underpants.
Nobody's out there to help you, nobody can hear you scream, and yeah, in movies you're probably going to find some aliens and they're not likely to be super friendly. But see, horror movies that go to space, that's very different. They've got to make a transition to space, right? How many movie series start on Earth with nothing to do with science fiction at all, and then all of a sudden in a movie, like a sequel happens, and they're just, now we're going to go to space, right? I mean, it does happen, but like, oh my god, I think I just figured out where the Fast and Furious franchise ends. But in reality, seriously, how many sequels go to space where the first one doesn't? Moonraker for James Bond. Still, I think this is the perfect microgenre to start this series off because there are very few examples. I wish there were more. I don't really care how cheesy it is. I love these movies. So what are the rules? It has to be a horror movie. It has to be a sequel, and it has to go into space when the previous movie in the series hadn't gone to space at all. Okay? We're going to start with Leprechaun in Space from 1996. Now, we're doing this because I think this is the quintessential horror sequel to go to space. It's the 4th Leprechaun movie, and it jumped the shark. Totally. It's the Moonraker of its franchise. There was no need or logical reason for the Leprechaun to go to space. But let's just do a quick run through. Leprechaun 1 is the Jennifer Aniston one in a house. Leprechaun 2 is the bride of the Leprechaun. Leprechaun 3 goes to Vegas. Leprechaun 4 goes to space. Leprechaun 5 goes to Hood. And Leprechaun 6 goes back to the Hood. Now, there are some other Leprechaun movies that happen after that, but they don't have Warwick Davis in it. And a Leprechaun movie without Warwick Davis is like an Evil Dead movie without Bruce Campbell. Okay, sorry, like a Freddy movie without Robert Englund. Like a Jason movie without Kane Hodder, where he runs and sets booby traps. Yeah, these are all franchise killers. Like, where are the sequels now, right? So that's a rant for another day. Leprechaun in Space was directed by Australian filmmaker extraordinaire Brian Trenchard Smith, generally known for these great B-movies he makes. He had just finished the 3rd Leprechaun movie where they went to Vegas, and for the most part it's a comedy. So the idea of going to space, based on a pitch where Trenchard Smith explains the scene where the green leprechaun bolt of power goes up the stream of pee and into one of the space marines and then bursts out of him later, seems like the perfect mid-90s lunacy in filmmaking. Basically, he pitched Aliens, but with a leprechaun instead of the aliens. So the thing about Leprechaun movies is that they need the humor, right? So the charm is in the rhymes and Warwick Davis's mischievous performance, and then you add into that all the tropes of sci-fi, like alien princesses and space marines and lightsabers. And then all of a sudden, this direct-to-video title has been just a little unfairly maligned, in my opinion. Okay, but that's the tone, right? It's campy, it's weird, and it's one of the few roles that Debbie Dunning played outside of Home Improvement. And this is one of my favorite Leprechaun movies. It's like the third favorite out of 8. So that's not bad, right? That's like, what, that's a B? A C+? Like, that's not bad. Okay, when people want to denigrate the idea, which is admittedly silly, of taking a horror franchise into space, they will say Leprechaun goes to space. But if they don't say Leprechaun goes to space, they almost definitely say Hellraiser Bloodline. They might not even say Bloodline, but they will remember that it went to space, and it sucked.
Look, time is of the essence.
Bloodline is an Alan Smithy movie, and interesting for a number of reasons. I'm actually quite fond of this movie because, like the best B movies, it has a number of interesting scenes or ideas that make it stand out and entertain, despite the mess that it might have been overall. But we're going to have to unpack this just a little bit. So an Alan Smithy movie, if you're unaware, it means that the movie had such a troubled production, usually meaning the director's so unhappy with the final product due to studio interference or whatever the problem is, that he wants his name removed from the film entirely. And in those cases, the name Alan Smithy is often used. Not always, but often used. The basic plot of Hellraiser surrounds this little ornate Rubik's Cube called the Lament configuration. And once the person solves it, it unfolds itself. It opens a doorway to another universe or dimension where these guys named Cenobites exist. Demons of pain, mutilated in bondage gear. The Hellraiser films, there's like a dozen now, are all been on decline basically after the second one. Parts 3 and 4 are declining steps and qualities from there, but they at least retain an attempt to expand the Hellraiser mythology. Parts 5 and onward just become direct-to-video films made in Romania on the cheap with repurposed generic horror scripts that they could just write and paste Pinhead into for just a couple scenes, and then they call it a Hellraiser movie. And now the last don't even have Doug Bradley, the actor who played Pinhead, in them anymore. And that's just a basic layout of how the franchise sits. Let's go back to the first 4 and talk about them. Part 1 is an introduction to the idea of the Lament configuration, and Pinhead makes his first appearance. The second movie expands on those ideas. We actually get to go through into the Hell Dimension, and we see the birth of a brand new Cenobite. The third movie was scaled back in production, and so Pinhead kind of spends most of that movie trapped in a pillar, but by the end we get to see some 90s Cenobites that spit CDs and have cameras in their faces and stuff. So, oh, and most importantly, of course, we get an origin for Pinhead that I won't ruin here, but that's also adding to the mythology. So, what's in part 4, and how did we get to space? Now, I personally think that Bloodline is one of the most ambitious Hellraiser films by far. Sure, it falls short on execution, no doubt about it, but I love the attempt. With all of Pinhead's backstory now fleshed out, pun intended, Part 4 gives us an origin story for the Lament configuration itself, which is a really cool idea. But it's also an anthology story, meaning multiple stories connected by some thread. So in this case, the story about the Lament configuration in Part 1 has a toy maker in 1796 France as a period piece. And then the second story takes place in modern-day Manhattan, where an architect, a descendant of that toy maker, is having like nightmares or cursed with visions of the Lament configuration creeping into his dreams and designs. And in the third story, we finally get to space in the future aboard a brand new space station that's just going online with the latest descendant of the same bloodline. Right? Bloodline. Hellraiser Bloodline. Okay. Now, Part 4 is also the last film that involves creator Clive Barker, who wrote the story, and Peter Atkins, who wrote the screenplay, was also the writer and director for Part 2. Now, during production, the studio wanted more Pinhead, and they added a voiceover and completely reshot entire scenes, while also cutting 25 minutes out of the film. The director walked, and so the new scenes were filmed by director Joe Chappelle. Side note of note, if we just could, Joe Chappelle had just finished directing Halloween 6, which had its own production problems. But before Chappelle came aboard the Halloween 6 production, there had been talks about getting John Carpenter back to return, and his idea for Halloween 6, I kid you not, is to put Michael Myers on a space station, and that got rejected by the producers. So while Halloween has yet to make a space sequel, that was the closest that we got. So poor Joe Chappelle, right? To go from one production nightmare straight into another. I think everybody did their best, but sometimes things just don't work out. We can see Adam Scott from Parks and Rec is also in it as a really skeezy, skadooshie type guy.
What is this?
So you don't bruise.
And you know what's funny? When this movie came out and people would rightly say it was the worst of the 4 Hellraiser movies, now we're like 9 or 10 now, or however many we are into this thing, and it's still better than every single one that follows it.
Time to play another game.
Another game. Yeah, sure. I mean, I think this one was pretty good, but I guess you are selling it.
I have such sights to show you.
I love the Critters movies. That's where we're going next. I love Critters 4. I love the Critters movies. And what's interesting to me for this entry is that the Critters have been aliens and known to be aliens as such since the first film. But it isn't until the 4th movie that we actually go into space and, you know, on a spaceship and see other planets and all that kind of stuff. The Critters themselves, they're just tribbles from Star Trek, right? But with teeth. They eat and they replicate and they create mischief and they eat people. Critters belongs to a subgenre of little creature horror movies like Gremlins and Ghoulies and stuff like that. And I think that this movie totally justifies its space sequel. I mean, it's organic to the Critters universe. It might be tough to find a reason to get Michael Myers on a space station, but, you know, the Krites have always been aliens, so that's easy. Now, that doesn't really make it a much better production or story than Leprechaun 4 or Bloodline, but if you're a Critters fan, you're a Critters fan. And if you're not a Critters fan, then at least the high-caliber performances by Angela Bassett and Brad Dourif should suffice.
Can we get out of here now?
Almost. Just 2 more movies to mention. Okay. I'll admit it. This one barely qualifies, really. It's not even really a sequel, but clearly releasing a movie called Dracula 3000 within 4 years after a big Hollywood movie called Dracula 2000 seems like an easy draft off of name recognition, right? And then you add to that Dracula 2000 had 2 legit direct-to-video sequels of its own, Dracula 2 Ascension in 2003, and Dracula 3 Legacy in 2005, and released between them in 2004, sporting an H.R. Giger movie poster, which is easily the coolest thing about the whole movie, is Dracula 3000. So if it's not a true sequel, then I'll make one other argument for it to be on the list. Considering that you could include it in the legacy of Dracula films, I think that this one going to space kind of counts in at least that respect as a sequel to classic Dracula in general. Captain Abraham Van Helsing is played by Casper Van Dien of Starship Troopers and Sleepy Hollow fame, and he leads a team consisting of Erika Eleniak from Baywatch and Under Siege, and Coolio, who should need no introduction.
Got kinda high and kinda drunk.
Plus there's Udo Kier, Tiny Lister Jr. rounding out a great direct-to-video cast.
I am a vampire, and ain't nobody bad like me.
And the vampire himself is Count Orlok, right? Which is a not at all updated 1950s version of Dracula, which fits with if you're going to say this is like those classic movies, but going to space as a sequel.
His name is Orlok. Count Orlok of Transylvania.
Yes, this is a bad movie, and sometimes that hurts watching it because you could see some people are really trying to do something and give it their all. Like Coolio was all in.
You remember that, bro? We were high for days, swimming in Comptonian ass, boning so many hoes. My nuts were swole for a week.
And Comptonian hose, that's got to be an ad-lib, right? I mean, I guess it just doesn't matter that they pretend to not understand cultural references like, what's a vampire? Because that's from the olden days. But then Coolio is just straight contemporary vernacular for everything else. So why not Comptonian hose?
Vampires? So what the hell is a vampire?
The truth is, this feels very much like an adopted sibling to Leprechaun 4, or like second cousins, as if they could exist in the same universe of silliness. There's just very little tethering Dracula 3000 to pop cultural relevance as it might be if they say put a Wishmaster in it.
You are really beginning to annoy me.
I think if they had just put the Wishmaster in this and this was Wishmaster 3000, people would care a little bit more. But if you like Leprechaun Goes to Space, then you gotta check out Dracula 3000 because you will enjoy the similar bad tastiness of all of that.
Blah, 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 blah.
All right. We're finally here. We're at the end. Yes, I know. Everybody was waiting for me to get to Jason X. This is clearly the best out of all the offerings in this episode, and I want to leave us all here on a good note. So why is it good? Why is it good? You really just asked that? I mean, we got Kane Hodder, which is the best, most definitive Jason all that ever there was. And I'm not just saying that because I think he would throttle me to death. Kane Hodder was Jason 4 times, and some were great, like in part 7, some were not, like part 9, and some already broke the ridiculous meter, like in part 8. But through them all, we got the best Jason. Something about the way that Kane Hodder moves. It's just definitive. He is the Jason. Now, let's see. You're gonna put Jason in space, so why don't we just check all the boxes, right? Spaceship, check. Nanotechnology, yup. Holodeck, sure thing. Cameo by David Cronenberg.
Yes.
And when we're going so deep into the sci-fi comic book world, why not give him a cool sci-fi makeover, right? You might think that this is dangerous territory to go into, some tried and true formula. It took Jason 3 movies before he got the trademark hockey mask, right? So now you're just gonna mess up with it. But in my opinion, this is one of the all-time great redesigns, like the black costume Spidey after the red and blue duds. Now it's pretty crazy that there's only 5 of these movies. I guess Machete in Space would count, except that it's just a trailer. Not really a horror though. I could include Highlander 2 when the Immortals come from planet Zeist, but that's also not really a horror movie. There's Predator, right? Predator 3 goes to another planet, and the first 2 Predators don't, but it's not really a horror, but he is an alien that's skinning human beings and hanging them from trees, so that's kind of horrific, right? If you can think of another horror movie that goes to space in the sequel, let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to know. I'd like to see a Chucky Goes to Space. I'd like to see a Wishmaster Goes to Space, like a whole planet full of Wishmasters. I'd like to see a sequel to House that goes to space, but there are no houses in space, so then we would call it Station, but then nobody would even know that it was a sequel.
Station!